So let's journey back to 16th century India. It's a time of incredible change, and at the very heart of it all, you've got two monumental figures. On one hand, a poet saint, a man whose words would go on to shape the faith of literally millions. And on the other, a powerful emperor, whose reign would define an entire era. We're talking, of course, about Tulsidas and Akbar.
A revered saint and a powerful emperor. Now, you'd think their paths would have to cross, right? But here's the mystery. History gives us two completely different accounts of what happened when they did. Were they bitter enemies? Or were they maybe unlikely allies? One story is all about divine defiance, and the other is about quiet cooperation. So what really happened? Did these two titans clash, or did they find common ground? That's the puzzle we're going to piece together.
All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll get to know our two main characters, the poet and the emperor. Then, we'll dive into the two wildly different stories about them, the story of imprisonment and the story of protection. After that, we'll look at the huge revolution of faith that was happening at the time. And finally, we'll try to figure out why we have these two completely opposite tales.
Okay, let's set the stage. To really get what's going on with Tulsidas and Akbar, you first have to understand the world they lived in. And believe me, the 16th century in India was an absolutely electric time of change, and these two men, they were right in the middle of it all.
So, on one side you have Tulsidas, the poet. But he wasn't just a poet. No, he was starting a full-blown spiritual revolution. I mean, think about it. He wrote the epic story of Ram, the Ramcharitmanas, not in some highbrow classical language, but in Awadhi, the language of the common person. He was basically democratizing faith, making these sacred stories available to everyone. At the very same time, you have Emperor Akbar building this massive empire. And his big idea? A really radical policy of universal peace, or Sulhi Kul, which was all about promoting tolerance and dialogue between different faiths. So you've got this revolution from the ground up with Tulsidas, and another from the top down with Akbar. Both of them were totally reshaping the soul of India.
All right, let's get into the first story. This is probably the one you're more likely to have heard. It's the blockbuster version, you know? A dramatic, epic showdown between raw worldly power and unshakable spiritual faith.
And wow, is it dramatic. It all starts when Akbar summons Tulsidas to his court and basically demands he perform a miracle. Prove you're a holy man. But Tulsidas just says, look, I'm just a humble devotee of Lord Ram. That's it. Well, Akbar doesn't take this well. He sees it as defiance and throws the poet in prison for 40 days. But here's where it gets incredible. In that jail cell, Tulsidas supposedly composes the 40 verses of the Hanuman Chalisa, one of the most powerful hymns in Hinduism. And the moment he finishes, bam! The story goes that a massive army of monkeys suddenly descends on the city, causing chaos everywhere. A totally shocked Akbar realizes his huge mistake and immediately sets Tulsidas free. What a story, right?
But that's just one story. There's a totally different version of events out there. One that some historians and historical records point to. And this one, it's not a tale of conflict at all. It's actually a tale of protection and, believe it or not, patronage.
Yeah, see, in this version, the biggest threat to Tulsidas wasn't the Mughal emperor. The irony is, it was his own people, the Orthodox Hindu scholars. They were absolutely furious that he dared to write the Ramayana in the language of the common folk. I mean, he was taking sacred knowledge out of Sanskrit and putting it into Awadhi, basically breaking their monopoly. They saw it as heresy. Some accounts even say they tried to have him killed for it.
And get this is a verse Tulsidas himself wrote, and it's just stunning. He says, "Call me cunning or a heretic. I will beg for alms to eat and sleep in a mosque." Just think about that for a second. The implication is huge. He's saying he felt safer in a mosque, a Muslim place of worship, than he did among his own conservative Brahmin peers. That tells you everything about the kind of pressure he was under.
So in this version of the story, Tulsidas eventually comes into contact with one of Akbar's top ministers, a man named Abdurrahim Kane Kana, who, by the way, was a brilliant poet himself, deeply into this whole new wave of devotion. Rahim is so impressed with Tulsidas that he sets up a meeting with Emperor Akbar in Kashi. And what happens? Well, far from throwing him in prison, Akbar is blown away by the poet. So much so that he orders Tulsidas to be taken under royal protection, to keep him safe from his critics. There's even a painting in a museum that supposedly shows this very meeting.
Okay, so now we've got two completely opposite stories. One of imprisonment, one of protection. How is that even possible? Well, to figure that out, we need to zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture. This absolutely massive revolution of faith that was sweeping across the land. And that revolution was called the Bhakti movement. This was a huge socio-religious shift. It was all about a direct, emotional, personal connection to God. You didn't need priests, you didn't need complicated rituals, and you definitely didn't need to know classical languages like Sanskrit. It was faith for everyone.
And the core ideas of the Bhakti movement? They were basically Tulsidas's entire life's work. Writing in everyday languages like Avadi and Hindi, pushing back against rigid caste systems, focusing on personal devotion instead of complex ceremonies. And, crucially, it involved a lot of interreligious dialogue, especially sharing ideas with Sufism, which was also focused on a direct experience of the divine.
And here's the kicker, the part that connects everything. Akbar's whole political philosophy, his policy of sol-e-kul or universal peace, getting rid of the jizya tax on non-Muslims, holding these big interfaith debates in his court, it was basically the political version of the Bhakti movement. You could say it was a kind of top-down translation of the same ideals that were bubbling up from the grassroots. The emperor's policies and the people's faith weren't just running in parallel, they were feeding off each other, creating this incredible new cultural climate.
So that brings us right back to the big question, doesn't it? If the world they lived in was all about this shared spiritual and political energy, and their ideas were so similar, why do we have this other really popular story about conflict and imprisonment? Why two completely different stories?
Well, let's look at them side by side. The narrative of conflict. It's all about Akbar imprisoning Tulsidas. The Hanuman Chalisa becomes this incredible act of protest. It's an adversarial relationship. Then you have the narrative of cooperation. Here, Akbar protects Tulsidas from orthodox forces. Their relationship isn't adversarial, it's symbiotic. One is a powerful story about faith-defying worldly power. The other is an equally powerful story about interfaith harmony and enlightened leadership. Both can't be factually true in the same way, but both tell us something really important.
But here's the one thing that is absolutely undisputed, the enduring power of what Tulsidas created. The Hanuman Chalisa itself is central to that first story of conflict. But it came out of an era that was all about dialogue and synthesis. And whether it was written in a prison cell or a quiet study, it doesn't really matter in the end. It remains one of the most beloved and recited hymns in the world, embodying the very soul of the faith Tulsidas championed. So in the end, we're left with this question. How do the stories we tell about the past end up shaping how we see our own present? Maybe we'll never know for sure what really happened between Tulsidas and Akbar. And maybe the most important question isn't which story is true, but rather, why do we choose to tell one story over the other? Because the narrative of conflict and the narrative of cooperation, they aren't just about the 16th century. They're about us right now and the kind of world we want to see. It really makes you think.